My background is, very briefly, I'd enrolled as a male nurse in the Hobart Hospital, and I'd started training there, and I went to a party one night, and some of my friends were going to art school, and they said, you know, why don't you come along? And so that was precipitous, so I packed up a folio of drawings and paintings, and I went along and got into the art school. And that was the beginning of it all. And that was, you know, a wonderful trip right through to the present day. My background my family's background was in trapping, hunting, fishing, and skinning and tanning skins, etc., etc. My parents were, my mum was a teacher in a primary school, and my father was a trapper and skin buyer. And so that was my background. I mean, my dad, that's me, my dad was a fisherman, and that's what my background was. I put myself through art school by hunting and fishing. I trapped possums, skun possums, sold skins, and had a trapping run on the Great Lake, on the island in Great Lake and around an area of that. For skinning rabbits, we had 10 dozen traps, and so we spent 2 or 3 weeks up there skinning and gutting and sending the rabbits off to market in Hobart. That was pretty much my life, and that was the beginning of it all, until I got a job at New Norfolk High School, and it was teaching. Basically, I trained as an art teacher, and my initial training was in maths and science, and so I taught maths and science for a couple of years. Eventually, I got a job, and it was just a wish that I would be employed in Launceston as an artist with Jeff Tyson and Alan McIntyre. And I got a job there teaching ceramics, doing drawing, and the chance of setting up a sculpture department at the beginning of that. My life really in Launceston sort of developed, and so I imagined a sculpture department, and these are shots from the initial workshop at Inveresk. So I really knew nothing about sculpture at that stage after having done two or three years training. My training was in figure modelling and stone carving, and I had zero background in anything else. So it was really pretty much learn as you went. I got a job within the university system, and on the banks of the North Esk River, and these are the shots from this particular time in the workshop on Alexander Wharf Road. Eventually we moved to the Newnham campus, and I'd spent some time overseas working in a foundry. During that time, I'd picked up a series of skills with lost wax casting, and really basically I spent the time as basically a slave, working in a foundry, pouring metal and polishing belt buckles. Basically, there were big Mack truck belt buckles, and I used to polish them from day and night. And I did that for 4 months. And that was an experience that really toughened me up. I met and I lived with Dick Marquis, a well-known glassblower in America, and he introduced me to a lot of people. I was really very conscious of the fact that I knew nothing and that I returned to Tasmania, and I set up a foundry within the art school situation. These are large moulds, lost wax moulds, within the foundry at Newnham. And we did a lot of casting, and Les Cossats, we did a lot of casting for Les Cossats, who was a well-known Victorian sculptor. They were sheep mainly, and they were cast them in aluminium. I met Peter Taylor, who had been my teacher in Hobart, and he was in charge of the sculpture department in Hobart, and I was basically in charge of the sculpture department in Launceston. This is Dick Bett, myself, Peter Taylor, on the East Coast, or West Coast, on the West Coast beaches. There was lots and lots and lots of logs of hue and pine available at that stage. And the Northern Sculpture Department and the Southern Sculpture Department used to come together at that beach for the first week or two in the beginning of the new year, to drag logs out of the bush, out of the beach, and carve logs and basically get to know the students. Later on, we followed through with these. After Peter Taylor resigned, we followed through with trips to the Blue Tier, and these are some of the shots from that particular time. It gave us an opportunity, or gave me an opportunity, to actually get to know the students at the beginning of the semester, and working with them and innovated projects with water mills and carrying the power from the water wheel along to the shore, and building structures and forms that were driven by water. This is a shot of a tree that previously year in the Blue Tier, and it was the only tree standing. And then we decided to wrap it and set it in stone. I became really concerned about the deforestation that was going on around my home in Underwood. And I started to make a series of works that this particular work it contains the skin of Tasmania, the southern coastline of Tasmania. And it was made for a past premier of the state, a trophy for Doug, and it was Doug Lowe. And he, at that particular time, four wood chip companies that was in Tasmania were very, very active. And so I designed a skin an axe skin, which is basically the flesh of Tasmania. And then it's the four pegs or the four poles that hold the work to the wall were designated the wood chip companies. I made a series of axes and I bound them in cages, and I used that image over and over again. I had the opportunity in the 1990s, late 1990s and early 2000s to do a project with at Spring Bay at a wood chip mill. And when there were artists selected for that particular project, and this is a particularly early shot of all the wood chips that were left when the mill closed. And the idea was to do a work that fitted within the confines of the buildings that presently existed on the site. I chose this particular room. And there was lots and lots of wood chips available. So I set to work building tree stumps out of wood chips, and I wrapped the mesh in Glad wrap and put lots of glue on the surface and rolled them in the wood chips. So I was able to create a series of stumps. So I took the room and I decided to actually build a pretty much a cut down forest and a valley that you will walk into it. This is the structure that we set up, and that's how it eventually looked. The trees had been stumped off, cut off, and the really last wood chip was in a glass case in a dome at the end of the passage. So that was a big step forward for me, and the works were up for a couple of months. In the meantime, I started to make larger works, and I collected lots of curved tree trunks and branches from wood chip sites prior to the burning of the wood chips. And I made a series of larger works. I'd been working really small at that particular time. So I started to experiment with using forges, hot metal, wrapping and binding. I named them the death ship. I was very, very interested in the time with Egyptian culture. So I made a series of larger works. These two works are in the gallery next door. I became interested in binding and wrapping and steel, working with steel. And that's the next to a particular work in Hobart at a Rosny Regional Library. I became interested in knots and tying and wrapping. I got a commission to make a work. The architect had decided that the railing went past the window, and I got a commission to do something in the railing, do something in the window to make it look pretty. And so basically I tied a bow in the knot, in the pipe. And so I became really interested in these curves and tight and knotted sections. And a lot of that follows through in my own work. So this is a sculpture at a Burnie school, and it's part of the gymnasium. And the sculpture was to make something to do with the activities that happened in the gymnasium. And so I looked at the games that they were playing. They were playing tennis in the gymnasium. They were playing all sorts of games and that. The left-hand side of the work is bouncing a ball around the edge of the perimeter of the space, and then it lifted up to a throw and disappeared through the wall. I went on to make larger works, and I got a phone call from a friend in the United States to work in the United States and at the university and on exchange. Her name was Pat Hickman, and she became a really good friend. We were basically joined together with a postgraduate program at the University of Hawaii. She was a fibre artist, I was a sculptor. We spent lots of time together, and she got the commission to build a series of gates on Maui at the Maori Cultural Centre. Unfortunately, her basic material was pig's intestines. And basically, this is a work that is made from pig's intestine. Now, it's basically got sausage skin, and so it's made of protein, and if in the early stages it's softer, it's modelled around a balloon form, and as the protein dries, it becomes a solid form. So it's really quite tough, and to this day she's still exhibiting in the States with pig skin. So basically the dilemma was we needed to work out a way that she could upscale the work to make a gate. Now, I came up with this material, which is a white plastic material, which is the material that's wrapped around electronic equipment. And so she set up a workshop with wraps of this material. You probably want to pass that around so it's feeling. And then she started to weave and knotted large sections of the gate. This is a shot of the knotted material, and she would pack them in a box. I was back in Australia by this time, send it to Australia. I would unpack it and lay it out in this form and pack it into moulds to cast. Now, the material is quite flammable, and it packs down with sand, and if you introduce molten metal into the sand, it vaporises away and is replaced by aluminium. This is the foundry at Newnham campus. It was successful. It was a very, very successful foundry. I taught sculpture there and was mostly interested in creating a new industry and student base for Tasmania. My second art school in Hobart was specialising in wood, and so I took the advantage of using my skills, or my developing skills, and I had an attitude of saying yes to any project and then worried about how much it would work. We had a very, very, very successful foundry, and that's the result of pouring pretty much 20 litres of aluminium into the sand, and the flame is a result of vaporising away the cloth at the wood. This is a piece of cloth which has been now cast in aluminium and within the sand mould itself. I would join more foam onto there and recast it in sections. The gates were 3 metres by 2.5 metres in dimensions. This is a rough shot of the gate, lifting it out of the mould material. And that's after clean-up. Now, they brought considerable funds into the university, and in those days, like 1998, was $3,500 came into the sculpture department, and so it made it independent of the vagaries of university life. This is unpacked. I added to the sculpture department's number of workers and staff. There were 3 full-time staff and 2 part-time staff, together with myself, who were running the foundry. Now these are the shots of the gates being unloaded and fitted into the gate hardware that we had previously installed. So you can see that the aluminium picked up quite delicately and quite firmly the details on the surface of the aluminium. This is a set. There are 5 sets of gates, 2 sets of gates. And that's Pat and my younger self moving through the gates. I went back after 30 years in February this year to restore the gates. They hadn't been looked after, they had lost their shine, they'd gone black, and they wanted them to be resurrected and looking back to their present condition, or present condition 30 years ago. I spent 3 or 4 weeks over there sandblasting, working with other sculptors to resurrect the gates back to the form that they are presently at. Now, by default I became head of the school in 1998, and although we had a reputation for having a really good foundry, I had a phone call when I was in Singapore recruiting students for the art school, there was a job going in Taiwan, and could I do it? And I said, oh yeah, sure. Eventually, I was put on a plane from Singapore to Taiwan. I met the artist who had made the sculpture, Zhu Ming, who was a very, very prominent artist in the East, in Japan and in China. Now, his original work was cast in wood. He used lots of chainsaws, cut out forms, and this was a very, very big commission. And the commission was for the Safety military base, the newly Safety military base in Singapore. And so I got flown up for a day. I got taken to his workshop, asked him to give us a number by the time you get back to Melbourne. And I said, oh yeah, sure, it'll be all right. I had a flightless and sleepless trip back to Melbourne, and was probably seriously worried about I'd overstepped my confidence somewhat. This is, eventually I said, yep, yeah, sure, we can do that. We'll cast that work in bronze, and it's a 4.5 tonne or 5 tonne bronze. So this is the polystyrene model that we got from Zhu Ming in Taiwan, and that's a large, large piece of polystyrene carved by his precious hand, and we settled on a price of about $390,000 US, padded really well, and I had probably little idea how I would actually approach it. Previous to that, back in the States, I'd had some experience in the early 70s and late 70s of working in a foundry, the sandcasting. And so we used a sandcasting technique where we packed sand against the model and took a print off the surface of that. Now the sand was set with carbon dioxide or sodium silicate, so the sand model or sand panel was very, very stiff and rigid. And that's the mould for part of the sculpture. We buried the sculptures in a very, very large sand pit, pouring 20 litres of bronze into the sand and to making a series of panels. Now that's the panel sizes that we cast, and we welded together and fitted in piece by piece back to the original polystyrene shape. It was quite large. And that's roughly the very first shot that I've taken when it's welded together and holding together. The Army and Navy and Air Force were the commissioners in Singapore, and they took particular exception, and they travelled down to Tasmania to the foundry. And there were 5 of them, and they demanded that I put a plaque inside the sculpture and recognising them as the commissioning artists. This is a shot with Peter Taylor, my friend and lecturer, standing inside the sculpture. And that's the work leaving the foundry, wrapped in and ready to go to Singapore. I flew together with 2 or 3 workers and co-workers, and that's lifting the sculpture into the base in Singapore at the entrance to the Safety Military. That's quite a large shot of it. They insisted that these figures, or they were modified figures, that is the head, and that's a large leg, and this is Singapore. And the idea was that Singapore being a small country, they had power to kick over the rest of the world and fight. So that was a really good project to get, and we made quite a killing financially. The university did well, the art school did well, and the foundry did well out of that. There was a problem with the sculpture, and I arrived at the airport having installed it, and in Singapore, Changi Airport, no one gets called to the office. And I got a call saying, would David Hamilton come to the office? And I come to the desk, and I was sent to a small room where the major from the Singapore Army was present. And he said, your sculpture's covered in red spots. It doesn't, what are you going to do about it? And I had no idea where the red spots or rusty spots were coming from. So eventually we flew back to Tasmania and immediately sent a person back to Singapore with rust preventer. And so it was absolutely covered in iron particles that in Singapore's environment, they bloom like desert flowers, tiny pieces of rust or iron that had been adhered to the sculpture in the workshop and over the top of the patinas. In the moist conditions of Singapore, it's a bit like a bathroom after you've had a shower. The tiny little spots of iron bloomed like desert flowers over the surface of it, 10-cent size pieces of spots. And I was totally distressed about this. So eventually I had postgraduate students working in Singapore, the postgraduate students, and they took a series of photographs for me, and eventually we worked out what was going on, and there was iron from the grinders in the workshop had thrown tiny bits of iron filings onto the sculpture, and they then bloomed like desert flowers. Now, the army weren't impressed. Clearly, they had a big opening coming up for the whole military base, military, army, and air force base. So they wanted the spots gone, and they suggested I take the whole sculpture back to Tasmania. That was seriously frightening to do that. I mean, it weighed 4 tons. It was glued to the ground. It was just the worst days of my life. So I flew up with this. I flew up to meet the general at his golf club, and I said to him, look, these are shots over the last 2 months. The spots are getting less. and so they will go away. It's like a good pair of trousers they'll wear right up in wear. He was generally unimpressed. I took together some gold-plated golf tees and a gold-plated golf ball to gift for him, and he responded over lunch by handing me over a set of worry balls, which was the most appropriate, I thought. So it resolved itself over time. I visited the site maybe 5 to 8 years ago, and I couldn't get through the gate because of security. So eventually, previous to that, and visiting the general at his golf club, my son and I went with little die grinders together with a couple of postgraduate students and ground out every spot. There were literally 1,000 of them, and darkened off the spots. And so the rust issue was no longer an issue. I previously worked in the Maritime Museum in Western Australia, casting parts of the Dirk Hartog, the ship that was sunk off the western coast of Australia. Oops. And so I knew that the rust, and they were the expert in Australia on rust was based there, and so I carried with me the knowledge that rust would go away. The orange the orange of rust would go to dark brown, and dark brown would go to black, and would match the surface of the sculpture at the end of the period. So that was a very, very major commission, and it was a very worrying time for me. So I got an extra commission from Hawaii, and to cast a series of panels that fitted onto the wall at the Honolulu Conference Centre. Now, the volcanoes and lava is on the Big Island, and it's continually flowing in over the roads and into the sea. So the idea was to take some prints from the lava and to cast them into panels that stuck to the wall. No, so the lava is skin-like and flesh-like, and it's called Pahoehoe lava. And I was instructed to take a cast of the lava where it flowed over a bitumen road. And so we took casts. I flew back to Australia, to Tasmania, cast the panels, and in consequence, the panels have sensors into the back of the panels. So they're sitting gradually on the wall, and every time the artist was instructed that every time there was a volcanic eruption or some movement in the ground on the Big Island, that the panels in Oahu, that is Honolulu, would gradually shake. So they had sensors into the back of the panels, and they would glow red around the edges. So that was kind of fun, and it was a bit of a busman's holiday for me after the previous safety military episode. So going back, I became interested in knots and pipes and wraps. My mum was an avid sewer, and so there were all sorts of little bits of string and cotton on the floor often around where she worked. And I got the idea of absolutely upscaling these little fragments of the cloth or the fabric to upgrade and to make a larger work. So I started to build a series of larger works, once again bush logs and using steel. And so I concentrated on little fragments of those and saw a beauty in the surface of them. So I painted the surfaces, basically rather than red, green, or yellow or orange. I have invented a technique where I'd sprayed or placed lots and lots of different colours over the surface. These are works from the fire. This particular work is from the fire station in Launceston at the place. And I became involved in surfaces that were like slightly transparent. And I found that the upscaling of the object from a fragment, just a tiny, tiny little piece, was quite interesting to me. This work particularly is outside the Newnham campus School of Nursing. I became interested in the space that beyond the shape itself. And my talk today was beyond the object. And basically, this particular work was stuck to the floor. And the sense is that you are actually asked to continue on to complete the work, passing through the floor and around to the surface. I got a commission from the university to make a larger work, and that's the digital model for the large work. So I made a series of drawings and fit a series of sketches and modelling in 3D modelling. I came up with this particular solution. Once again, passing through the ground up here and missing out pieces. The work had the name of Bolt, and it was a lightning bolt. So I had the idea that ideas in ancient times came from lightning bolts who hit the ancient Greeks, and there was an idea. The old-fashioned or the later modern equivalent is the light bulb above a cartoon's head, with the idea that it's functional. So the sculpture was being built, and I was in charge of the foundations, digging the holes, the foundations. We employed a team of locals to do this. This is under construction in the workshops at near the airport, and having painted it, needed to sand the surface back to fit it onto the truck, and then it was delivered to the airport, to Inveresk, right on the back of a truck. I was anxious about how it would fit. It all fitted together, and they were totally competent workers. They fitted together. The part that's coming through the building was tightly fitted so that I imagine it was coming out of the sky, passing through, zigzagging across, passing under the path and up and through to the sky eventually. Now, the group of friends commissioned me to make a sculpture that linked the two sites together, to Inveresk and to Royal Park. And I chose to use a thread that wound down into the ground and passed under the city to reappear at Royal Park. So that was really quite exciting, and I built the sculpture within the art school right next door. The top right has a light, the digital light that shines into the sky. Now, we built the sculpture out of pretty much those fittings onto the ground here. So they were pretty much like pasta. And then you just glue them together. And that's on the right, the large piece that's now been repainted and is waiting to be installed at the behest of the museum. UTAS have reinstated it, it's been repainted, it's been totally worked out engineering-wise, re-established in the foundation, and the only hold-up is the museum. So that's the sculpture welded together and sandblasted and painted within the sculpture department at Inveresk. And that's it lowering into the ground, and that's how it looked when it was in its pristine form. Now, I had the opportunity to, I got a phone call from an ex-student who was on Bardu Island, and he was the manager on the island, and he asked me whether I'd be interested in casting some work from the community. They were printmakers by trade, and they had a really good printmaking setup, and they wanted to get the cast of the 3D modelling of whales and dugongs and turtles and so forth and so on. And I sort of said, oh, no, I don't want to do that. And he said, well, will you come up and build us a foundry? And I said, oh yeah, I'll do that. This is the first trip. I was surprised. I mean, Bardu Island is 60 kilometres off the southern coast of New Guinea. And I found out that later, the closest piece of island that Australia owns is within 2 kilometres of New Guinea. So it was quite a interesting trip in light plane and to land at the airport. And this is a shot of the original, my original trip. the crocket, there is a strange culture on the island. It's a closed island, and few tourists or white tourists were allowed to onto the island. The kids went swimming, and by nature, someone always had a rifle to shoot the crocodiles if they got too close. This is a shot, just a quick look around the island and the beginning of the foundry that we built. So we shipped up bricks from Queensland. We shipped up a furnace from my workshop in Launceston, and we established a little furnace and foundry on Bardoo. And I suspect that it's still running. The Minister for Aboriginal Affairs, Peter Scullion, the past minister, flew in for the day, and helicopter and his minions, and so we broke open moulds and cast some work. There was an Aboriginal community on Arakoon that was shipped up to take part in the workshop. I did this over 3 or 4 years, returning for a month or 2 months each year. And so the Arakoon Aboriginal community were mostly interested in camp dogs. And so they modelled wooden dogs, they painted them, and they wanted to be able to make an edition of aluminium dogs, which they would sell onto the art market. So while that was going on, I became interested in, I was concerned, interested in what the governments were doing. And I made this particular piece as a result of spending some time in Paris. And I did a series of drawings. And the federal government at the time, the Liberal federal government, my perception was I didn't know where we were going. And so I made this sculpture called Blind Boatman. So it's canoes on the head, moving ahead, not having a faintest clue where we were taking Australia. Our good past Prime Minister of 5 folios were crashing in. I modelled the little head from a photograph of one of the founding fathers of the Australian Parliament. Now, they were following through 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, heading into the rock. I became and was interested in the politics of salmon farming, and that particular work is a monument for Oakhampton Bay on the east coast, where there was a chance that a major salmon farm would be set up within the confines of the east coast and within the bay. Now, the sculpture is made from bronze and steel, and I became interested in a process called hydrographic dipping, whereas the images, 3-dimensional images, are adhered to the surface of the object. I made this particular boat in Paris, and I was stunned by the closeness of the community, the lack of trees, and the intensity of the rehousing and rebuilding. The boats became a metaphor for me to speak about the world. This particular work is modelled on St. Peter's grave, and it was to do with industrial fishing. So the work is called St. Peter's Last Fish. The fish was lying on the grave of St. Peter, the fisherman, etc., etc. I got some ideas parallel to making these boats, to a large work for the Bondi sculpture installation, and I made a large work which is made out of letters, and it's called Jack in the Box. So it's J-A, Jack in the Box. Together with my friend Farquhar Steele, we got a commission for a large sculpture in Burnie, and it was a very, very big sculpture, and the Burnie City Council wanted a major work to open up and gesture people to enter the city. So we came up with this solution to be made, and it became a welcome gesture. Just like when you go into a restaurant, that a restaurateur or the waiter would show you to the desk or show you to your seat. So it was a series of poles, and quite large. This is a digital model of the work, and this is the work under construction. We were contracted to build the sculpture and also the landscaping around the base of it. And to date, it's probably, certainly for me, it's my largest work, together with Jeff. So that's a shot from up the hill looking down on it. So the highway going west is on the left, and the road going into the city, into the Burnie city, is on the right. And that's kind of all. Yeah. Thank you.